weed office. I've worked for Kittitas County for 23 years now. Worked for 3 years before that for the Colville Indian Reservation up in Okanagan County. So I pretty much my entire career has been in invasive plant management. I'm just going to give you kind of a brief introduction to the common invasive plants of Eastern Washington and give you some identification tips and then also some control recommendations as well. My current screen, Tori, I can't see the chat, so if you can just go ahead and call out those questions whenever you see a good time to do them. So
Sounds good.
with my cell phone is probably the best way to get a hold of me. My email's there too, but cell phone, you can feel free to text me. A lot of people will shoot me an image and ask, "Hey, Mark, what is this? How's the best way to get rid of it?" And that really is, regardless of what county you're in, I'm happy to help with doing identification over the phone like that. It actually works pretty well. So let's just jump right in. So, what is a noxious weed? Just a quick definition here of what a noxious weed is. So these are non-native invasive plants. There's a lot of species that are native plants that can be opportunistic and sometimes after disturbance can be weedy for sure. But all the plants I'm talking about today are non-native and invasive qualities. So that being, they invade natural areas and then dominate those plant communities once they get there. That's not good because that poses a threat to our environment and also our economy. These noxious weeds cause a lot of damage to our local agriculture, so that's a big part of it. But also, like just the Endangered Species Act, for one, the number one threat to endangered species in Washington State is loss of habitat. The number two is invasive species, which includes both plants and animals, but it is definitely a serious threat to endangered species in the state of Washington. Generally, most of these plants are fairly difficult to control as well. Some of them are annuals, prolific seed producers, some of them are biennials, and a lot of them are hard to control perennials. And also, all these plants that I'm talking about today are listed on the State Noxious Weed Control Board list of invasive species. So there are a lot of species out there that aren't native, that are weedy, but aren't listed as a noxious weed. So the difference between an obnoxious weed and a weed could be like a dandelion's an obnoxious weed. It's growing in a place that you don't want it. Scotch broom is a good definition of a noxious weed. It's listed by the state, required to be controlled throughout the state, and depending on where you are, control may or may not be required. So, why control these weeds in general and any other weedy species? It's a really important part of any overall land management, whether that's a small chunk of garden space that you're managing at your home, or you're talking 640 acres of rangeland, 640 acres of forest. Invasive plants is going to be a big part of that land management program. These plants are going to use space, moisture, sunlight, nutrients, all that you want to be utilized by either your native ecosystem or your desirable plants and crops that you're trying to grow. Some of these plants do have some beneficial qualities. Common St. John wort is one that I like to highlight on that. It has a lot of beneficial qualities in the medicinal herb world, but its overall impact to a native ecosystem is going to be negative. It's actually a prolific spreader. It can really impact riparian systems, but a lot of people view it as a good plant because of all its medicinal qualities. So it is good in some ways, but overall impact on a native ecosystem is not healthy. The other one, final one, is that you may be required by state law to control these species. So those noxious weed laws that we have in our state, there's two that kind of mandate, two RCWs, 1710 and 1704. Both of those just basically try to limit an economic loss due to the presence and spread of these noxious weeds. And then we also have a WAC, Washington Advised Code. This is what sets the state noxious weed list every year, sets the classifications of those weeds, and then also updates any monetary penalties. Some counties do fine for noxious weed violations. Kittitas County here, we are not although we do have the authority to issue civil infractions, we never have. We would be in an enforcement county where if a property owner or landowner refuses to abide by the noxious weed law after repeated attempts to work with our office, then we sometimes do go in and cause those weeds to be destroyed ourselves at the expense of the landowner. That happens about 2 times a year out of about 3,000 contacts. So it's pretty rare. There's also what's called a quarantine plant list that the Department of Ag creates. These are those plants that are prohibited to distribute in the state of Washington. So that's sale, offer for sale, transport in the state of Washington. Couple good examples of that are purple loosestrife. That's a good one. That it is kind of an ornamental aquatic plant, but it is on the quarantine plant list. Any questions about the noxious weed laws or the makeup of county weed boards throughout the state before I kind of jump in to some of these weeds? Perfect. Okay. So the weed classifications. Their Class A's are kind of the most. They're posed at the biggest threat to the state of Washington, but they're also the most limited distribution. So these are very rare plants. In Kittitas County, we only have one Class A species that we will find on a regular basis, and even that's I only know of two sites that I'm working on in the county, and that's wild 4 o'clock. That's the only Class A species out of all the Class A's. I think there's 39 of them listed in the state of Washington that we manage. Most other counties have quite a few. We've done a pretty good job of once they show up in Kittitas County, we eradicate them as soon as possible. Class Bs are the bulk. These are kind of the meat of the noxious weeds in the state of Washington. Scotch broom is a great example. It's a Class B. It's non-native. It's abundant on the west side, but fairly limited in the east side. It poses a serious threat where it is limited. So in eastern Washington, like Kittitas County, for example, and in our county, it is designated for control. As soon as you jump over to in King County, Pierce County, it's not required to be controlled over there, although it does do a lot of damage. Class C noxious weeds are those that are widespread throughout the county, and control is decided at the local level. Canada thistle is a great example of this. Kittitas County is one of the few counties in the state of Washington that require the control of Canada thistle, primarily due to the export hay market. So we go after it fairly hard. So let's just jump in right into these invaders. Let's meet some of these weeds. I will highlight the Washington State Noxious Weed Control Board's webpage. That's nwcb.wa.gov. It's a great resource for all your noxious weeds listed in the state of Washington. They have good pictures, they have good written findings, and pretty good recommendations on those species. So it is a good source that I always try to highlight. Definitely a good source of website to look at noxious weeds. Okay, let's jump into two of the most common ones we have in eastern Washington: diffuse and spotted knapweeds. So these are the Centaurea genus. Centaurea genus is pretty weedy throughout. There's several Centaureas in the state of Washington that are noxious. The Centaurean genus mostly originated from the Mediterranean area, the mountains of the Mediterranean, so it adapts well to eastern Washington. And a lot of the Centaureas, whether they're ornamentals or whether they're escaped ornamentals, can be pretty opportunistic in the right conditions. Diffuse knapweed and spotted knapweed are the two biggest offenders. Diffuse knapweed primarily lives as a biennial, whereas spotted knapweed tends to be more of a perennial. These two species do reproduce by seed only, so they don't reproduce by the roots, just their seed, even though they may be a perennial. The flowers of diffuse are generally white, so there on the left you see the lower left picture. That's a diffuse knapweed flower head. The flowers of spotted knapweed are generally pink, so there in the lower right, that's a spotted knapweed. But you can't use a flower color as a good identification for any of the Centaureas. You want to use the bracts. So the bracts are what make up that flower head, those little spiny comb-like structures that make up that flower head. You can identify and key out any Centaurea by using those bracts. Spotted knapweed's bracts are tipped black. They're spotted. So that's how you can identify a spotted knapweed versus a diffuse knapweed. And they can hybridize with each other as well. So that adds another part that sometimes can be a little tricky. But I also try to tell people these two species are very similar to each other. They're both very aggressive. They're both widespread. They're both noxious. I wouldn't get too caught up in identifying which is which. They're both bad. They both should die. Kill them both. Widespread in eastern Washington and starting to impact western Washington as well, especially spotted knapweed. So meadow knapweed, this is one of our hybrids that I mentioned. So this is a hybrid between brown and black knapweed. So we have neither brown knapweed or black knapweed in Kittitas County, but we do have this hybrid. It's actually more common in the state of Washington. So meadow knapweed's a perennial. Can be pretty aggressive in our county. We have it all over the Teanaway and Blewett Pass corridors. That's where it likes to occur. It's also along I-90 and then the Yakima River. It prefers a little more moisture. So as far as strategies to control this species, um, picoram's the most effective, but that's a long-lived herbicide, and I don't recommend it that much to a regular landowner. Aminopyralid is probably your next best bet, and that's typically what I recommend to landowners for most knapweed control. Aminopyralid is Milestone or Whetstone. Those are the two generic products that go by aminopyralid. It's a selective broadleaf herbicide, very effective on any of the knapweed species. I've tried for many years to try to get biological control established on meadow knapweed, but it haven't had much luck. Biocontrol for diffuse and spotted knapweed has been very effective. Not just in our county, but throughout eastern Washington. It's seed head weevil, and there's a couple flies as well. They both only reproduce by seed and are not super long lived. It's very effective. Meadow knapweed, it's only reproduces by seed, but it's very long lived, has a large root crown, and the bios just don't seem to cut it on that. And now we have Russian knapweed. So this is the final one that I'm going to talk about. It now is a not a Centaria. It used to be called Centaria repens, but now it's Ocroptilon. Just genetic differences. So through genetic mapping, they decided it was a slightly different genus. I still refer to it as a knapweed. It's a perennial, reproduces by both seed and roots. This is a rhizomatous perennial, forms real thick colonies. Probably the hardest control species of any of the knapweeds. It's also allelopathic, which means it exudes a biochemical through its roots into the soil, kind of that retards the growth of the grass that would compete for all the nutrients that it wants. And it's able to thrive in those conditions, but most of the grasses and other broadleafs don't. So a tricky part about controlling Russian knapweed is if you control it either through mechanical or chemical means, when you're done, you're not left with much native vegetation underneath that canopy. It's pretty much been all crowded out and killed off through that biochemical. Very dense stands makes this plant really difficult. It also is toxic to horses. This plant contains the same alkaloid that yellow star thistle has that causes chewing disease. It's basically a brain disorder that leads to dehydration if consumed enough. So chewing disease in our area actually occurs more from Russian knapweed than does yellow star thistle, simply because we don't have much yellow star thistle at all. So reviewing the knapweeds, mainly control. So hand pulling can be pretty effective on diffuse and spotted knapweed. They're short-lived perennials or biennials. They have a taproot that doesn't typically go too deep. So as long as that ground isn't compacted and, and it's somewhat loose or wet, control. It's really hard to pull meadow and Russian knapweed, so I typically don't recommend that for those two species. Mowing can be a fairly good strategy if at flower, and then you're gonna have to mow again. But knapweed is notorious, like a lot of other species, for learning how to put out lateral branches below what your mower can cut. So it's still going to produce flowers, still going to produce viable fruit and go to seed. So you're not really helping yourself out too much. I view mowing as a short-term solution to come back with something else, whether that be pulling or chemicals. As far as chemical solutions, short-term herbicides that work, 2,4-D plus dicamba is okay, glyphosate's okay. These are short-term solutions, so if you're going to follow up with some kind of re-veg, this is probably what you want to use. Long-term herbicides for areas that are like rangeland or forest land or permanent pasture, I really probably would recommend Milestone, which is aminopyralid, over anything else. It's non-restricted use, it's easy to locate, it's super safe on grass, and it's one of the greener herbicides you'll find as far as its impact to the environment. Fall applications can also be effective. A lot of people forget about fall applications. The month of October is a great time to spray any of these species. Biennials will have rosettes that are going to be mature plants next year. Perennials are taking sugars to their roots, so you take that herbicide with it to the root system, which is ultimately what you need to do. I mentioned the biological agent, Larinus minutus, is the most common. It's a seed head weevil, and it's a great choice for areas that are 20 acres or more and are not disturbed by grazing or driving. So if you have a back 40 that's got a lot of knapweed, doesn't get disturbed much, Larinus is a good choice for that. We have spread them throughout our county. We've distributed. We used to do 10,000 bugs a year in our county. They're pretty much found anywhere in Kittitas County now, so we don't really distribute as much as we used to. Any questions about knapweed in the chat there, Tori?
Nope, not yet. But again, folks, if
Perfect.
you put anything in the chat, I'm happy to help get your questions to Mark.
Okay, we're moving on to the thistles. So Canada thistle is probably the most common thistle throughout the state of Washington. Pretty well-known species. This is a creeping perennial, so it spreads through its roots. 80% of the biomass of this plant is actually underground. You're only looking at 20% of its biomass. So a huge root system makes this plant very, very difficult to control. As far as compared to other thistles, this thistle has small flowers, so about fingertip size, the size of your tip of your finger or so, about a half inch in diameter, and they occur in clusters. They're not a big globe flowered thistle. Because of their rhizomatous structure, they form dense clonal growths, and then they actually have both male and female plants, but they don't need each other to reproduce. Very common in eastern Washington. You can find it from forest land, pasture, all over. Garden. This plant can adapt to just about any. I found it at 6,000 feet elevation. I found it at, out in Vantage, Washington, where we get 6 inches of rain a year. So it's one of the most adaptable species there is. Musk thistle. So this is fairly common in Kittitas County in parts. So like the Nanum Range, the Nanum State Forest, from basically Blewett Pass east over to the Columbia River, a fair amount of musk thistle in places. Beyond that, it's not too widespread. Throughout the state, it's not super widespread. Okanagan County has a fair amount of this. Our friends across the border up in British Columbia have a fair amount of this. It's called nodding thistle up in British Columbia. So this species is one of the large globe-flowered thistles. It's a pretty large plant. Can grow up to 10 feet. Typically is about 6 feet tall. Not a whole lot of branches on it, but can be branching, especially if the meristem gets disrupted. Real stout main stem. That main stem at the base is going to be about an inch in diameter. So pretty stout main stem. Real sharp spines on all of its margins, just like all the thistles. And then, like I said, large globe-flowered thistles, 2 to 3 inches wide. They'll nod over. So instead of pointing straight up to the sun like a bull thistle will, they will nod over. And that's why the British Columbia, the Canadians up there across the border, call this nodding thistle. Pretty distinct distinguishing characteristic of the plant once it's mature. I spent a lot of time chasing this plant in the last. So I mentioned bull thistle earlier. You can see that those flowers are pointing straight up towards the sun. They're not nodding over, so that will be one way to distinguish it. It also is a little bit more dark green in color and definitely has more pubescence, more hair and spine-like structures over its plant leaf surface and margins than any of the other thistles. So lots of hair, lots of pubescence on this plant. Large biennial though, 2 to 6 feet tall. Large globe-flowered thistles, not quite as large as musk thistle, about 1 to 2 inches wide. Lots of spines. Very, very common. So you'll see this in pasture. I see this in my yard every now and then. A random rosette will pop up in my yard, and I'll just pop it out with a little spade or something. But where we see it a lot of is in forest land, and it usually takes disturbance to cause an infestation to erupt. So a thinning project, a fire, like, we're looking at this fire right now up here off of Blewett Pass in First Creek area. I suspect on that north slope, you'll have lots of bull thistle for a couple years afterwards. It eventually gets outcompeted by just the shade of the understory as it starts to come back. It's not very shade tolerant at all. So bull thistle we don't go after it super aggressively. We tend to go after it mostly on roadsides, so we try to prevent its spread from going into places that's not here. There is a native look-alike that a lot of people confuse with bull thistle, and that's Indian thistle, or some people call it as edible thistle. That's Cirsium eldule. It is definitely similar in structure to bull thistle, but has more pubescence on the actual flower head in its bracts. So you can see bull thistle here to the upper right in that picture. There's no really pubescence inside between the those bracts that make up those flower heads, all those spines, pubescence in that flower head. That would be the main, most limited in our area. A fair amount in Yakima County, a fair
Hey,
amount in
Mark.
Okanagan County. Yeah,
Sorry, I had a comment. Somebody asked if you can move the little, you were sharing the screen. I don't know if that's movable at all.
I'm sharing the screen. What?
There's like a little like tab on
Oh,
top
I
of your
gotcha. Yeah,
slides.
yeah, I might be able to move that. How's that?
Perfect. That's great. Thank you so
Perfect.
much.
Thanks for the tip. You
Yep.
bet. So Scotch thistle, this is the most robust of all the thistles that we have that are invasive in the state of Washington. This sucker is very, very large. It's one of the ones that's kind of grayish in color too. It's not really green, gray-green in color. Lots of cottony fiber on its rosettes, especially in the there in that lower right picture. You can see a good picture of its rosettes when it first comes up. And okay, there we go. In Kittitas County, we've definitely seen an increase in this over the last couple of years. It used to be just found at kind of older ranches that have been around a long time, but we're starting to see it spread. We're seeing it spread in the firing center. It just seems to be showing up more and more every year, and that's pretty concerning because we definitely want to try to. I mean, we'd like to eradicate the species from Kittitas County. It's a fairly lofty goal, but it's doable. We try to control all sites in the county every year. Like I said, very, very large thistle, up to 8 feet tall, but not just tall, it's also wide. Its branches are very wide and can be up to 6 feet wide in structure. Really, really large lower leaves. I'm talking up to 2 feet long and a foot wide. So you see a small plant and it's a thistle, it's green, it's probably not Scotch thistle. These are tree-like thistle structures that can be very, very large. Again, it does have the globe flower thistles that are very spiny. They are going to point straight to the sun. They're going to about be 2 inches in diameter. There is a native lookalike that I like to highlight, make sure people don't mistake the two, and that's a wavy leaf thistle, Undulatum. So wavy leaf thistle looks pretty similar. It's gray-green in color. Flowers are pretty similar, but it's just not near as robust. Stem's not near as big. Leaves have deeper cuts in them. They're far more deep cuts in its leaf. That's why it's called wavy leaf. But it's just simply a smaller structured plant. Lower leaves don't get near as broad as Scotch thistle. But I've seen it out in the Quillamine a fair amount that can be 5, 6 feet tall. Fair amount of it came back after the fire that was out there in the Whiskey Dick wildlife area. So a lot of people they confuse this with Scotch thistle at first, but if you take a close look, you should be able to tell the difference just in basically size. So control of thistles, pretty similar to knapweeds, really. Um, Hand pulling can be pretty effective. Not that effective on Canada thistle because you got to get all those rhizomes. All that rhizomatous structure can be, reproduce. So hand pulling Canada thistle is not great. But if it's like in your garden and you just have a few coming up, it's probably what I'd recommend. Mowing thistle is just like mowing knapweed. Short-term solution, but it's not going to kill the plant. It's going to disrupt the meristem of your biennial thistles. So usually that leads to more branches, more flowers, more seed produced if you don't follow it up with anything. Um, as far as herbicides go, short term, same 2,4-D, dicamba, glyphosate. Those are all good strategies for sensitive areas. Glyphosate doesn't have any soil residual at all, so it's good for replant areas. Long-term herbicides, almost always recommend either clopyralid or aminopyralid. So either Milestone or a product like Transline, which is what clopyralid is. Where clopyralid would be recommended over aminopyralid is where you have forest situations because clopyralid doesn't affect conifers at all. You can actually do over-the-top applications on conifers with clopyralid. So no conifer-bearing tree is going to be impacted by that. Whereas aminopyralid, spruce trees are real sensitive to it, and young pine trees are fairly sensitive to it. Is mature pine trees not impacted at all, but young saplings would be for sure. Moving through the thistles, going to move into some mustards. So hoary cress, Cardaria draba, these are perennial species mustards that are deep rooted, hard to control, and very, very widespread. Yakima County, king of this plant. It's got it all over the place. Um, Numerous small white flowers are in dense flat top clusters. We have a fair amount of it in Kittitas County as well. It's one of the first plants that we go after. It matures early, Typically by May, it's already flowering. We generally just call it by white top. There's also hairy white top and hoary crest, really, really similar species. They kind of get combined into one species for the most part. They're both cardarias. It is one of the first noxious weeds to mature and flower in eastern Washington. And one distinguishing characteristic of it, once it's in flower, is its densely clustered flower heads. So you can see that picture looks like a cauliflower. That's how dense it is. If you have a loosely growing panicle, or if it's starting to elongate, the raceme starting to elongate, you're probably looking at something like shepherd's purse or pennycress, one of those other white flowering mustards that may be non-native, maybe somewhat weedy, but isn't going to really go after your native vegetation like hoary crest and hairy whitetop will. Another close cousin is perennial pepperweed. So some people call this tall whitetop. It's different genus, Lepidium, but similar in what its impact as far as impact to the native area. This particular species really impacts riparian zones. It grows very, very well in riparian areas, and super deep rooted make it very, very difficult to control. Perennial mustard, huge root system, kind of got a big crown. Numerous stems emerge from that pretty woody root crown. One way to distinguish it when it first comes up, its leaves are very, very waxy and have a real distinct mid vein. Not sure if you can see it down here in this lower left picture, but these mid veins of these plants are pretty distinct, more so than most other species. Combine that with its waxy structure, and then once we get its flowers, it's a very cloud-like canopy with milky white flowers in dense rounded tip clusters. It can tolerate a lot of different environments, but we typically see it where it gets its feet a little wet. It can handle pretty dry ground. I've seen it growing in some very dry ground, but it likes to have its feet wet, so that's why it likes riparian zones. Horiolisum is kind of a newer invader, perennial mustard. And it poses a pretty big threat because it's pretty toxic to horses where it grows, and it likes to grow in hay. So this is a new invader in Kittitas County that we're really trying to prevent its establishment from. It can grow as an annual, and where conditions are poor, where conditions are good, like in a hayfield, it pretty much acts as a short-lived perennial. Plant's kind of grayish green in color with white flowers. You can see here its flower clusters aren't near as dense as white top. It starts to elongate out and get fairly loose. The best way to distinguish Horiolisum from other species like shepherd's purse, for example, is its leaves at the base. Particularly, it doesn't have much leaf structure on the upper part of the plant, but it does have very noticeable basal leaves, and they're very rough to the touch on the surface of the leaf, almost like sandpaper. So whenever I'm trying to describe Horiolisum, I have people grab that basal leaf in between their thumb and fingers and kind of rub it. If it's kind of rough to the touch, it's got these flowers, then it's most likely Horiolisum. Most of those other mustards don't, they lack all hairs in general. White top has a lot of pubescence on its leaf, but it's soft to the touch, not rough at all. And it is toxic to horses. Most common thing is edema and laminitis, and it can be definitely impacted because it likes to grow in alfalfa. That's where we're seeing it. Okanagan County, Ferry County, they have a lot of problems with this. Stevens County, in their alfalfa hay. So where we've got it, two of the sites were brought here from hay purchased up in northern counties. Control of these perennial mustard species. Well, just like anything, small early infestations can be grubbed out, hand pulled. Try to get as much of those rhizomes as possible, as much as that root system. Otherwise, you're not going to starve that plant enough from its carbohydrate source. These plants are palatable, except for Horiolisum. But as far as white top and pepperweed, very palatable. Actually, cows will seek it out. And grazing is fairly effective. Grazing is a good strategy for white top, particularly. And I've seen both species graze out pretty well with either cows or goats. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend that too much with Horiolisum, but it's primarily toxic to horses, not cows. But typically would never recommend grazing just because it's a new invader, very limited in distribution. So we're going to want to try to spray it and eradicate it as soon as possible. As far as herbicides go for mustards, and I'm talking all mustards here, like even your most common yellow flowering mustards like flicksweed and tansy mustard and Jim Hill mustard and tumble mustard. So 2,4-D is effective on all your mustards, especially the annuals. It's also pretty effective on your perennials like white top and pepperweed. So just 2,4-D by itself, got to have a pretty good rate of it, but it's pretty effective and doesn't have a long residual, so it's not going to be in the soil for very long. Your SUs, your sulfonylurea herbicides like chlorsulfuron, that's Telar, or metsulfuron, that's Escort or MSM 60. Those are excellent on any of the mustard family. They're a little longer term. They'll be in the soil for about 2 months. That's your typical replant interval on using either Telar or Escort is usually 2 months, sometimes 3. But these species typically don't affect grass. They're not recommended for lawn turf, but definitely pasture grass is tolerant to it and can be very effective. You could spray both at kind of bud stage or fall for the perennial species as well. That's my cap on mustards. Going to move on into some hound's tongue here. So hound's tongue is one of your borages that we have in the state of Washington that can be problematic. A lot of people are familiar with the burr it produces, but not the plant that produces that burr. So this is a biennial or short-lived perennial. Typically is a biennial though. Produces these large rosettes, clumps the first year, and then the following year is going to send up these mature plants that are going to flower. Those plants typically are about 2 feet tall. They have these drooping panicles that are kind of purple magenta in color. And then once those flowers mature, they produce a very noticeable green burr that's very sticky. They'll start to turn brown and then gray. A lot of people call these hitchhikers. They're flat. They're about a 1/4 inch wide and will stick to anything. They're like Velcro. And people get them on their shoes. People get them on their pants. Dogs will get them. Cows will get them. That's how it moves. In each one of those little flat burrs, there's like 4 seeds, and it spreads quite quickly. It is highly toxic to cows, highly toxic to horses. Contains the same alkaloid that tansy ragwort has, so it's going to cause liver damage. It causes cirrhosis of the liver, and it's irreversible. So one hound's tongue will not kill a horse, but one hound's tongue per week for 6 weeks will kill a horse, but probably not for about 4 months when that liver decides to fail. So in Kittitas County, we do not have any tansy ragwort. We do have this plant. It's fairly widespread. So we get a diagnostic from a vet every now and then of tansy ragwort poisoning. It's typically not that; it's hound's tongue poisoning. So that same pyrrolizine alkaloid that tansy ragwort has, hound's tongue has as well, and is actually a more common offender in eastern Washington. As far as control goes, generally recommend an SU. So that's metsulfuron, that's your Escort or your Telar. Milestone's also pretty good on killing these rosettes. So a good combination is Milestone plus Escort. Poison hemlock. This one's getting a little bit of more notoriety out of this state just because of its livestock. This is a tall biennial, grows about 12 feet in height. Typically is about 6 to 8 feet. You don't see a big one 12 feet too often. Very parsley-like. It's in the carrot family, so it has parsley-like leaves. They're kind of shiny green, highly divided, and then large white umbels of the plant. Entire plant is toxic. So there's a couple different hemlocks in our state. We have water hemlock, which is also highly toxic, but it's a native plant. Its roots are where all the toxin occurs, whereas this plant has toxins throughout the entire plant. Its seeds, its flowers, its leaves. So it's vegetatively very toxic. If you're going to control this, definitely wear gloves. You might even wear a mask, especially if you're trying to weed eat it or mow it. Definitely wear a mask. If you were to ingest just a small fragment of this plant, it can cause issues. And if you were to inhale it and get it in your lungs, it definitely can cause issues. That's been known to happen. So wear gloves. Pulling or severing the crown just with a shovel is fairly effective on this plant. You just got to try to get it before it produces viable seed. As far as herbicides go, definitely now these days I'm going to recommend Duracor or High Noon. That is a newer herbicide that has a new product called Rinscore. That's this peroxyfen product that is highly effective on anything in the carrot family. So it's very good on poison hemlock. Typically, that's what we're going to recommend. It's also approved for riparian areas where typically this plant likes to grow. So yes, highly toxic plant. There has been a couple human fatalities from this plant, mistaking it for wild carrot or wild parsnip. So caution definitely needs to be used with this plant, and it's fairly common. It was a good year for it in Kittitas County. We saw a lot of it. We typically spray it and try to control very widespread in some areas. I get a lot of pushback from because it's a pretty flower. It's actually one of my favorite flowers. But it's a perennial and it's not native, much to a lot of people's dismay, and can actually take over and cause damage in quite a few different areas, both riparian and forest lands. It causes lots of problems. So this plant, distinguish it from Shasta daisy. Shasta daisy is just a much bigger plant. Its leaves aren't near as small and tiny as this plant are. Its stem is much more robust, and the flowers are bigger. They look exactly the same, but they're bigger. Yeah, the flower of Shasta daisy is about 3 inches in diameter from the tip of one petal to the across to the other, where this plant is only about 1.5 inches. But if you're up in the forest and you see, wild daisy growing along the roadsides in a fairly consistent pattern, you're probably looking at oxeye daisy. Classic daisy flower, yellow petal or yellow disc, white petals. One thing that's easy to control with this plant, it is very shallow. So you don't see it in agriculture very much. It spreads through the laterals of the irrigation system pretty well. But as soon as a field is cultivated, it can establish itself. So that is one easy way to control oxeye daisy, is just through simple, shallow, easily digging or pulling. Uh, it's fairly palatable, so mowing or grazing is also an effective strategy for this plant. As far as herbicides go, typically I recommend either Milestone or clopyralid. So either Milestone or that Stinger Transline product that clopyralid is, depending on if you have trees or not. This is on the quarantine plant list too. So if you really, really like it and you want to take some home, technically you're breaking the Department of Agriculture's quarantine plant list law. Scentless mayweed, a similar plant, although it's can be more common in some places. It tends to be more common around agriculture. So we see a lot of this in our grain fields. Very common in wheat, barley, triticale, all those different grains that we grow in the state of Washington. It's an annual, short-lived perennial, prolific seed producer. It starts producing flowers and seed in May, and will flower and produce seed all the way until frost. That's what makes this plant kind of difficult to get ahead of. So to distinguish it from oxeye daisy, flowers are about the same size. There's more flowers per plant than oxeye because it's more branching. But if you notice this leaf structure, on oxeye daisy, you had a lance-shaped leaf that was slightly lobed, whereas this plant is so highly divided it wouldn't even be a regular leaf. Looks just like a feather almost. So super, super highly dissected thread-like segments of a leaf. That's what distinguishes this plant. And it's also really dark green. Kind of really stands out when it first starts to grow. Isolated plants, you can probably try to mow them or dig them up. It is fairly easy to do that way, especially if it doesn't have flowers. As far as herbicides go, it's a tough plant to kill, tough plant to get rid of. Definitely got to use a little longer lived herbicide typically to control it. Otherwise, you won't stay ahead of the seed production. And that's typically why we recommend either clopyralid, aminopyralid, or MSM, which is your metsulfuron. Annual bug loss. So if you're from the Spokane area, this is a very, very common plant up in that country, Pend Oreille County, Spokane, all through there, Lincoln County. Once you get over here, not near as common, but we do have it. We're trying to keep this plant in its areas as much as possible. It's a very prolific seed producer, even though it's just an annual, it produces seed all year long, and it's hard to stay ahead of. This is in the borage family. It's got stiff, bristly hairs over the entire plant. If you're familiar with fiddleneck tarweed or common fiddleneck or coastal fiddleneck, this plant is very similar to that in vegetative structure. It just doesn't have yellow flowers that are in the fiddleneck. It has little blue flowers in clusters. These leaves are alternate. They're very, very warty in appearance. You can actually see the dimples of the leaves, of the hairs all over its leaf surface. So they get a little warty appearance. And it's kind of wrinkled. It almost looks like it's been sprayed and then it's kind of grown out of it. Its flowers are pretty, actually kind of pretty. Basically, remind me of a speedwell flower. That's what its flowers are look like a speedwell, in clusters. Like I said, here's your fiddleneck, your coastal fiddleneck. That's a very common native of the borage family, and before it flowers, it looks very, very similar to bugloss. Sometimes I tell landowner if they're unsure, just give it a couple, give it a couple weeks, see if it flowers. If you see yellow flowers, it's fiddleneck, which can be quite weedy, especially after a fire, but it's not a noxious weed. Whereas bug loss, we're trying to eradicate from the county. Here's a typical infestation that we see along the edge of a field. Like I said, those plants, you can see how wrinkled and warty those leaf surfaces are. If you were to touch them, stiff hairs that kind of almost are stickery. As far as controlling goes, we found that just pulling and bagging is very effective. It's one of the easiest plants to pull because it's very shallowly rooted, and it almost always has flowers by the time we notice it. So pull and bag so you get no seeds to hit the ground. As far as herbicides go, um, typically we're going to recommend an SU herbicide. So that's Escort or Telar. You're going to need either one of those two species or those two herbicides with whatever mix you're going to do. Also, because of its stiff hairs that are going to try to beat up that droplet of whatever you're applying to it, an MSO or silicone blend surfactant is going to make a big difference. In Kittitas County, we're trying to track this plant for sure. So if you think you see it, this is one that we definitely want you to report. Toad flax. So there's two species of toad flax in Kittitas County, Dalmatian and yellow. Um, they're both widespread in eastern Washington. In rangeland, you typically see more Dalmatian, and in forest, you typically see more yellow. So Dalmatian is here on the left with its heart-shaped leaves that clasp that stem. Yellow toadflax is here on the right with its very linear leaves that are about 2 inches long and very, very skinny, only about a quarter inch in diameter at the most. So both of these are hard to kill perennials, very aggressive. They both have a milky latex in its stem and leaves. So if you were to break that open, it's going to have a milky latex like a dandelion stem does. They both have yellow snapdragon-like flowers. So that we don't have any native yellow snapdragons in the state of Washington. This is a plant that I see people digging up and planning taking home quite a bit because it looks like a wild snapdragon. And please do not do that. It is on the quarantine list. All Linaria, anything in the genus Linaria is on the quarantine list in the state of Washington. This yellow toadflax particularly is a common contaminant in wildflower mixes as well. So I do caution people, be careful with wildflower mixes unless they're certified. If it's a certified wildflower mix native for Washington, Pacific Northwest, great. Those are great. But if it's not certified seed, a lot of times you get weedy species like bug loss, like yellow toadflax, very, very common. Extremely difficult to control both these species. They both spread through their rhizomes as well as their seed, so you got to battle two different strategies there. Pulling can be effective if it's very, very loose soil and you can follow those rhizomes out. Dalmatian pulls pretty well because its stem is pretty thick and will stick to the rhizomes. Yellow toadflax doesn't pull at all because its stem is so fragile it breaks off. As far as herbicides go, again, Escort is a good one. Metsulfuron, Telar is good. That's chlorsulfuron. And then this product, aminocyclopyriglor, that's Method. That is one of the most effective products on it, but it's hard to find, hard to locate. It's very, very long lived. So typically we don't recommend that unless we're talking a roadside application. There is, luckily, a very effective biological agent for both these species, and that's Macinus. It's a stem miner. It works very good on Dalmatian and is somewhat effective on yellow toadflax. Not as effective, but on Dalmatian, it's helped a ton. It's helped us tremendously on the Yakima River where we don't really want to use some of these herbicides, and it's been a great partner. We've released a lot of them. Wild carrot. I mentioned poison hemlock and wild carrot earlier. So you can see here in the rosette how pretty closely resemblance there is to poison hemlock in that vegetative state. highly divided leaves, parsley-like. So that's where the mistake has been made by somebody that's not, super good at distinguishing the two species. I typically don't recommend you harvest wild carrot just where there is the chance of poison hemlock growing because of that fact. So taprooted biennial herb, it is a member of the carrot family, a close cousin to your domestic carrot, and will produce a carrot taproot. It's highly divided, parsley like leaves, and will smell like a carrot as well. Its flat top compound umbel is about 2 to 4 inches in diameter, pretty distinct. And then once these go to seed, they start to close in on itself in these seed heads, and that's very distinct as well. Very, very large seed. The seeds float very well, so this thing moves around in water. Another name for this plant is Queen Anne's lace. Hard to control. You wouldn't think carrot would be very hard to control, but it is. If it's just a couple plants you got, pull them up. That's no problem. Just get that taproot. But as far as in a hay field where it's quite abundant, it can be problematic. Typically, we're going to recommend something that has triclopyr in it. But that new herbicide that I mentioned, which goes by the most common names Duracor and High Noon, that is highly effective on this species. So if you have a serious problem with wild carrot, I'm probably going to recommend Duracor or High Noon application for sure. Common St. John's wort, mentioned this earlier as a plant that has some of those beneficial qualities in the medicinal world, but in the native ecosystems of Washington state can be problematic. If you look here, we got a couple different species in this pictures. We got some St. John's wort, we got some oxeye daisy, we got a smorgasbord. So this is a rhizomatous perennial. It actually reproduces vegetatively as well. So if you were to pull this plant and just throw it in the water in a riparian situation, that stem is able to send down a new root structure and reproduce that way. So it's not a plant that you can just pull and leave on the ground. Yeah, it is able to reproduce vegetatively. Plant has pretty distinct leaves, whereas they are have translucent dots if you pull them up to the sun. So you can see in this picture here, it's going to, in the lower left, if you hold those leaves up to the sun, they're small leaves. They're only about ½ inch long, ½ inch in diameter. So small leaves, but they have all these little translucent dots in the leaf that are going to let light through. That's the stigmata that's actually opening up. And the flowers always have 5 petals, but a lot of our natives, we have a lot of native species that have 5 yellow flowering petals. So that's not a great characteristic. A lot of times the leaves will have black dots on them as well. The stem is kind of rust colored. So that's another good characteristic is this stem that makes up this branch plant is almost always a reddish rust color. Um, as far as control goes, because it reproduces through its rhizomes, seed, vegetatively, mechanical means can be difficult. If you can pull it and bag it, you can definitely do that. Spend a lot of time pulling this plant on the Colville Indian Reservation in sensitive areas. And then as far as herbicides go, definitely Escort is what you want to have in the tank to control this species. That is very, very effective. Milestone by itself doesn't really give adequate control of this species at all. So this is definitely one where it grows a lot. Where like the Forest Service has a lot of issues with this plant. They typically are running Milestone on their roadsides, and it doesn't control this plant as well. So that's when you're going to need to add Escort. There also is a very effective biological agent called the Klamath beetle or Chrysolina. The Chrysolina beetle, it's a pretty large biological agent as far as that world goes. It's about a ½ inch sized beetle that's very iridescent in color. And it's a defoliator. So the beetles will come in, defoliate the plant, just strip it clean, and then move on. And they actually crash the population. It's just typically the plant will kind of rebound after a couple years, and then the bugs won't be there because they kind of move through in waves. But it is also an effective strategy that a lot of counties have used. We don't really have enough of it in our county to really get them to establish here very well, but we do see it in the upper county, so that's been great. Common tansy, I'm going to highlight this so we don't distinguish it from tansy ragwort. In eastern Washington, tansy ragwort really isn't that common at all. So it's going to be a pretty rare plant to occur in eastern Washington. Widespread in western Washington, but in eastern Washington, not very common. Common tansy is the opposite, very widespread, actually throughout the state. And just looking at the flowers is the best way to distinguish two. So here we have common tansy in the bottom right. Its flowers are a button, pretty much no petals. Tansy ragwort has a disc with yellow petals, and it's almost always 12 to 13, typically 13 yellow petals. So very distinct difference in flower. The plant structure also is different as well. But common tansy, which I'm talking about now, it's very aromatic. So very, very strong smell to it, and occurs in clusters. And then its flowers look a lot fern-like, very fern-like leaves, or not flowers. Its leaves are very fern-like. They're kind of divided, and it gets much taller than tansy ragwort as well. Common tansy can get 4 or 5 feet tall in places. It grows real thick. But pay attention to those flowers. In Kittitas County, we get reports of tansy ragwort a lot. It's almost always common tansy. Sometimes it's one of our native goldenrods as well. But common tansy is an invasive, aggressive, noxious weed, and definitely should be controlled. It can really impact irrigation ditch banks as well. Hard to control because it's a rhizomatous perennial and grows very fast. Mowing or hand pulling is typically not that effective. Milestone plus escort seems to be the most effective control strategy. On a irrigation ditch bank, glyphosate's fairly effective as well. You're just going to have to try to reseed with some grass if you want to. Kochia. So this species, very common. Yakima County's got the king of these plants. They're like 12 feet tall down there. It's a kind of grows in a bushy green, like Christmas tree like approach. You know, the flowers are very broad, or leaves are very, the leaves and branches are very broad at the base, and they kind of get progressively smaller as you go up. Its flowers are pretty much inconspicuous. They occur in these little leaf axils, but its pollen is definitely more noticeable. This plant actually is a huge um, producer of problem pollen. Very common one to be allergic to. So a lot of people get diagnosed with ragweed allergy. We don't have much ragweed in eastern Washington. We have no ragweed here around Kittitas County. But this plant is super common, and it's the one that produces all the allergens that you're probably allergic to. It is just an annual, but it's such a prolific seed producer that you have to stay on top of it. It germinates throughout the year. So pulling, mowing, tilling, all those things are very effective. You just have to be diligent about not letting that patch of kochia go to seed. As far as herbicides go, phylloxipure is definitely what I typically recommend. But dicamba also good, 2,4-D also good. That's typically what we're going to recommend. It's again, but you just got to stay after it. Like you could make an application of herbicide on this plant, and in 6 weeks you got a new fuzzy little green carpet coming up of new seeds that germinated, especially if it's getting water. So you just got, again, stay on top of that plant. It's going to be difficult. Going to highlight a couple ones that aren't near as common. So yellow star thistle. This is considered one of the worst weeds in the world. Not widespread in this area, but if you head down towards Tri-Cities, you're going to start to run into a lot of this plant. The southeast part of the state has been impacted by this plant quite a bit. Again, this is one of those centaureas, one of those native or non-native centaureas that have been problematic. So it is basically a knapweed. It's an annual, grows up to about 2 to 4 feet tall, and then has winged stems. Actually, they're winged. They got these little wing structures along the stem. And then its most distinct characteristic are its terminal yellow flowers with the bracts that have these long spikes on the end. So those spikes are about 1 inch long off the end of the bracts, which make it super spiny. Like I said, it's considered one of the worst weeds in the world. I think Washington, we have about 3 million acres infested. California's got like 20 million acres infested of this plant. Only good thing I've heard about this plant is it produces some good honey, apparently. Very rare in Kittitas County. We pretty much try to eradicate this. We found 2 new sites this year out in our wildlife areas out here north of Vantage, out in the Whiskey Dick and Quilmene wildlife areas. Hard to say how they came in. They probably came in with the fire. But 2 fairly large sites that we're going to be battling now for a couple years. So it's something you just got to stay on top of. We find this along I-90 almost every year in small patches, and we try to eradicate it as soon as it goes because it could do a lot of damage once it got here. Its skeletons during the early spring are actually a good way to distinguish this plant, or not really distinguish it, but locate it. So its flower head leaves that cottony fiber that's in the flower head, stays on the plant through the winter, and it gets really bleached out. So the stem gets all gray, the flower head gets all bleached out, and so they're pretty distinct. So this patch we actually found like in March, before anything was really growing, and we saw these really brightly bleached out flower heads, and we thought might have been Starthos, and sure enough, this was at Elk Heights about 15 years ago. This patch has since been eradicated. Rush skeleton weed. This is one of the ones that really is starting to move around in our county. And all the counties around it have it pretty widespread. And we're really trying hard to keep this plant from establishing. And we're winning some areas, but we're losing others. The patches that we have, we're making progress on, but we find new areas every single year. It just moves so much on our highways. This is a really hard to eradicate perennial. Continues to show up on I-90, I-82, Vantage Highway. Pretty much like its name, skeleton weed doesn't have really any leaves on any of its plant except for at the base. Pretty much a skeleton-like structure, 2-3 feet tall, 2 feet wide, lots of branches, and at the end of branches you get these little yellow flowers about 3/4 inch wide. It has a milky latex throughout the plant, and then one really distinct characteristic are these coarse kind of rust or brown colored hairs that point down towards the ground on the bottom 6 inches of the stem. So you can see here in this bottom 6 inches of the stem, you see those coarse, they could even be called thorns, that are going to be pointing down towards the sun, kind of hooked, or down towards the ground, that kind of hook down, and they disappear after that, and it's really distinct. So if you see a plant, it's got little yellow flowers, kind of skeleton like, look at that bottom 6 inches, look for those coarse hairs pointing down towards the ground, and if you find that, give me a call. We're trying to eradicate this plant. So this plant can regenerate from 2 centimeters of its root. That's all it takes to regenerate. So pretty much pulling is not recommended. You're never going to get all of that root structure. You're going to leave, you're going to leave a couple inches of root almost always. So typically we don't recommend that. Herbicides are definitely the most effective control for this plant. So typically, if it's an area that you can't use herbicides, you're going to have to try to dig and battle this plant as much as you can. Definitely, Aminoside which is that method product I mentioned, is the most effective product on that, but that's pretty much a roadside product only. In pasture areas, it's going to be Milestone plus 2,4-D. That's what I'm going to recommend. Rangeland areas also. Definitely need a good surfactant for this plant to break that surface tension, because you don't really have any leaves to hold that droplet at all. Another one I'm going to highlight is Tree of Heaven, not really because I dislike the plant so much, but because of what it's a host for. So Tree of Heaven is a non-native tree, really starting to spread around the state. It's been here for a long time. It's just now getting actually noticed, but it's all over the Columbia River from here all the way up to Okanagan. This is an invasive, fast-growing tree, very popular in a lot of cities as well. It can grow very tall. 50 feet tall is not too uncommon. It has both male and female plants. The females produce tons of seeds that spread all over the place, kind of like a maple. They got like a little helicopter on them. But the male plants really are what really spread, because they're rhizomatous and send out suckers everywhere. Really crowds out native plants, but it's the preferred host of the spotted lanternfly. And our Department of Ag is super worried about the spotted lanternfly. This is widespread in the eastern United States, and it's not when, or it's not if this plant or bug gets here, it's when. And its number one host is Tree of Heaven. What this bug would do, what spotted lanternfly would do to our grapes and hops, would be millions and millions of dollars worth of damage. So here's your spotted lanternfly for those that aren't familiar with it. So pretty unique looking bug, pretty easy to identify, as well as the moth. Very actually pretty and kind of striking in color. So if you ever see this insect, Department of Ag wants to know about it. You could let me know about it, and I can get a hold of Greg Hobrick with Department of Ag. But look for this particular bug whenever you get a chance, especially if you have tree of heaven. Now, distinguishing tree of heaven from, say, the sumacs that are very, very common, desirable native plant as well as ornamental. So here's a female tree of heaven with lots and lots of seeds in those papery wings. But here's the difference, really, that I would like to highlight between the invasive species of tree of heaven and our native, both staghorn and smooth sumacs. So the leaflets on tree of heaven, basically, it's not toothed or serrated at all. You can see here it's pretty much smooth margin, and on the sumacs, you always have a little bit of serration, slightly toothed. Another thing is the fruit. Sumac fruit has those clusters of red fruit. That's pretty distinct. And then odor. Tree of heaven stinks. I can be a quarter mile from a big patch of tree of heaven and I can smell it. It has a distinct, strong, unpleasant odor, whereas sumac really has no unpleasant odor at all. So those are some key differences between the two. Sumacs are great, no issue with those. Tree of heaven, Department of Ag wants you to get rid of it because of its threat with the spotted lanternfly. Last one I'm going to touch base on, Palmer amaranth. So this plant has been considered the worst weed in the United States for about the last 20 years, but it's never impacted the Pacific Northwest. It's a plant that occurs mostly in row crops in eastern United States, southeast, even the southwest, but never up in the Pacific Northwest. We knew it'd get here eventually because it'd probably be a contaminant seed. And sure enough, last year, two separate detections were found in the state of Washington. One was Spokane County. That was a patch. That was 150, 200 plants. And then Walla Walla County actually found two plants by themselves. So it's going to show up. Its seed's very, very small. It's hard to distinguish this plant from other amaranths that are both either ornamental or native. So it's one that we really want you to try to look for. Like I said, considered one of the most problematic weeds in the United States by the Weed Science Society of America. And this plant, one of the reasons why it's such a problem is because it's so adaptable. It builds resistance to herbicides quicker than just about any other plant out there. With the increase of GMO crops using glyphosate or 2,4-D, this plant has built resistance to those. So now, at first, it was just glyphosate resistance, so Roundup wouldn't touch this plant. Then they decided to try to tackle some of the issues with that with 2,4-D GMO crops. So plants that were could tolerate 2,4-D applications, and within like 5 years, this plant developed a resistance to 2,4-D. Now it's developed a resistance to dicamba as well. So this plant is just really, really tolerant to a lot of different herbicides, and could really pose a problem to our agriculture up here as well once it got started. So how do we know we're looking at Palmer amaranth? Well, it's a real tall annual member of the pigweed family. So if you're familiar with red root pigweed, it's a fairly common weed. It looks similar to that. It's just much more large species. You know, this it's going to get like 6 feet tall and a much longer spike. That spike, once it produces, is like 16 to 18 inches long, sometimes longer. Hairless stem, so no hairs on the stem. That's pretty distinct. And then its leaf also has a sharp spine on its leaf tip. Um, you can see it here, right here, real sharp leaf spine on its leaf tip right there. So that's one of the characteristics. The best thing, though, really, of all to distinguish it from all of the other amaranths is its petiole. So that's the basically the piece of the leaf that connects it to its stem. So this is the petiole here. If you fold that petiole on the back on the leaf itself, the petiole of Palmer amaranth is going to extend past the end of its leaf because it has a longer petiole than any of the other amaranths. So take that petiole, bend it over on top of the leaf, right to the leaf base, and if it extends past the end, the leaf tip, you're probably looking at Palmer amaranth. definitely give me a call on that. So here you look at other ones to the right, your common water hemp, your green pigweed, which probably is the most similar looking, which we do have in the state of Washington, and your red root pigweed. You can see if you were to fold that petiole on top of that leaf, it would only go to about the midway point of the leaf. It doesn't even come close to extending past the end of the leaf. So that's a good way to distinguish those Palmer amaranth. And again, its spikes are very long as well, much longer than the other pigweeds. So it is one to keep on the lookout for. Department of Ag is really big on trying to locate this plant whenever possible. Kittitas County would like to keep it from ever getting established in our county. Yeah, it's one that you shouldn't see, but if you think you see it, please give me a call. And absolutely, I'll control this species for free. So communication. So I mentioned earlier my cell phone. It's a great way to contact me. My email as well. Regardless of where you're at, you don't have to be in Kittitas County. I'm happy to help for weed ID, chemical recommendations, all those things. Happy to help out as much as I can. And you can help me out by whenever you see a group of plants or a plant that you've never seen before, send me a picture of it. Bring it by the office. Ask somebody there in your local county. That's how we're going to catch these new invaders like rush skeleton weed, yellow star thistle, Palmer amaranth. That's how we're going to find these plants and try to keep them from spreading out through the rest of Washington State. Some more contact information. Our office is here in the Armory building down here at the fairgrounds in Kittitas County. I'm currently outside right now because most of our office space is being used by the fire that's up there in Blewett. The fire team's here. Sometimes I'm busy mapping evacuation routes with the fire team as well. But luckily, that fire hasn't got to that point where I'm doing that yet. So hopefully they'll be able to stay on top of it. Lots more information on our office, plant identification, toxic plants. I'm pretty well educated about toxic plants in our valley. And we also do free walkthroughs of any property in Kittitas County. So if you do live in Kittitas County and you want to walk through to discuss either native vegetation, revegetation, noxious weed management, all that stuff, I'm happy to come out and arrange that. And we just schedule it up and I'll come out and do that. So beyond that, I'm happy to take any questions you guys got. And yeah, thanks for listening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. We do have one question in the chat. Is there a portal for community members to share weed locations?
No, not really. Probably would just be to either email me would be probably the best way to do, or the email the county, which is weeds at same address, which I mentioned earlier, weeds at co.kittitas.wa.us. But yeah, so there's no real portal. There is Ed's Maps does so that's a mapping program that the Nature Conservancy I think kind of started, and the Department of Ag uses as well. You can report weed infestations on Ed's Maps, and if it's a weed of concern, that report will get to our office as well. So that's also one way to do it.
Awesome. And then I did have somebody request to go back to the contact slide, but I
Yeah,
can
that's
also
my
send
very
that
first
information out.
slide. Yeah, that's my very first slide, so I can bring that up.
Oh, and somebody just put the link to Ed's map in the chat. Thank you, Renee.
Perfect. Yeah, Ed's Map is a good way to do that for sure.
Awesome. And then we have another question. How helpful is the Washington Invasives app?
The Washington Invasives app, it's decent. It's better with animals than it is with plant identification. The best one I'd probably recommend for identifying plants is probably there's one out there that some people use. Let me see if I can find it. Picture This. So Picture This is a decent app for plant identification. It's not always right, but I'd say 90% of the time, if you got a good picture of identifying structure of the plant, Picture This will be able to identify it correctly for you. At least get you in the ballpark. And I think there is a cost to it. That's its downside. I think it's like $20 a year. But I know a lot. In fact, a lot of the field guys here in Kittitas County, they use Picture This a fair amount. So.
All right. Any final questions for Mark? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Just a reminder to folks, we will be sending out a PDF copy of Mark's presentation. I'll send you guys an email with that, as well as when we get the recording uploaded to our YouTube page. And then I also put in the chat, which I will send in the email as well, if you would like to register for part 2, which is a field trip in Ellensburg at Racer Creek, where we're going to practice field ID skills for Eastern Washington invasive plants, and also do a little bit of a project tour for a riparian restoration project there. I put the link in the chat there, and again, I will send that out as well. But yeah, thank you so much, Mark. This was awesome and really helpful. If folks have any questions in the meantime, feel free to email me. And like I said, I will be sending all of those out via email shortly.
You bet.
Right. Thanks so much.